Sometimes the most powerful moments happen when nobody is watching. Sometimes the strongest people show their deepest emotions in the quietest places. And sometimes even those who seem untouchable by the world around them find themselves changed forever by a single, unexpected encounter. What you're about to read isn't just another royal story. This is about a woman who, despite wearing a crown, discovered something about herself she never knew existed. It's about how, one afternoon near the ancient walls of Windsor Castle, became the day everything changed. Not just for her, but for everyone who witnessed what happened next. The insider who shared this story asked to remain anonymous, but their words carried the weight of truth. They were there. They saw it all unfold. And what they witnessed that day would challenge everything the public thought they knew about their queen. This is that story. The morning started like any other at Windsor Castle. Queen Elizabeth moved through her daily routine with the precision of someone who had perfected every gesture over decades of service. Her private secretary, James Morrison, had arranged her schedule with military precision. Morning correspondence, a brief meeting with the Lord Chamberlain, and then what was supposed to be a quiet afternoon reviewing state papers in her private study. But the Queen had other plans. "I think I'll take a walk in the gardens today," she announced to her lady-in-waiting, Margaret Thornton, who had served her for over 20 years. Margaret looked surprised. The Queen rarely deviated from her carefully planned schedule, especially not on a Tuesday afternoon, when the castle grounds would be bustling with tourists and staff. "Your Majesty, perhaps the private gardens would be more suitable," Margaret suggested diplomatically. She knew how the Queen valued her privacy, and the thought of her wandering near the public areas made her nervous. The Queen smiled, not the formal smile she wore for photographs, but something softer, more mysterious. "No, I think I'd like to see what's happening beyond these walls today." What Margaret didn't know was that the Queen had been feeling restless for weeks. At 87, she had begun to reflect more deeply on her life, her choices, and the weight of the crown she had carried for so many years. The previous evening, she had stood at her bedroom window, looking out at the lights of Windsor town in the distance, and felt an unexplainable urge to connect with something real, something unscripted. She dressed in her simple navy coat and comfortable walking shoes, choosing to leave behind the usual entourage that accompanied her everywhere. Only her personal protection officer, Detective Inspector Sarah Collins, would accompany her on what she insisted would be just a short stroll. The afternoon air was crisp as they walked along the Long Walk, the famous tree-lined avenue that stretches for miles from the castle. The Queen moved slowly but deliberately, her keen eyes taking in details she had never noticed before during her countless formal processions along this same path. She observed how the late autumn light filtered through the nearly bare branches, how couples walked hand in hand in the distance, how children ran ahead of their parents, their laughter echoing across the open spaces. For the first time in years, she felt anonymous. As they approached the area where the Long Walk meets the public pathways, Detective Inspector Collins became more alert. This was uncharted territory, literally. The Queen had never ventured this far from the castle on foot without a full security detail and predetermined route. "Perhaps we should turn back now, Your Majesty," Collins suggested gently. But the Queen was drawn to something she couldn't quite explain. In the distance, near a cluster of old oak trees that stood just outside the castle's official boundaries, she could see a small gathering of people. Not tourists, these people weren't holding cameras or guidebooks. They seemed to be focused on something else entirely. As they drew closer, the scene became clearer. A young woman, probably in her 30s, sat on a worn blanket beneath the largest oak tree. She had shoulder-length brown hair that caught the afternoon light, and she was speaking softly to a small group of children who sat in a circle around her. The children appeared to be between 6 and 10 years old, and they were listening with the kind of rapt attention that children rarely showed adults. But these weren't ordinary children, the Queen realized as she observed them more carefully. Several used wheelchairs, others had visible physical challenges, and one little boy kept making repetitive hand movements that suggested he might be on the autism spectrum. Yet all of them seemed completely absorbed in whatever the young woman was telling them. The Queen found herself stopping behind a nearby tree, close enough to hear but far enough away to remain unnoticed. Detective Inspector Collins looked concerned but said nothing. She had learned over the years that when the Queen was determined to do something, it was usually easier to adapt the security around her decision rather than try to change her mind. The young woman's voice was gentle but clear as she told what seemed to be an improvised story about a magical kingdom where every person had a special gift, even if others couldn't see it at first. She used different voices for different characters, made sound effects with her mouth, and encouraged the children to participate by making the sounds of various magical creatures in her story. The Queen watched, fascinated as she saw these children, some of whom she imagined might struggle in traditional social situations, come alive with imagination and joy. A little girl in a wheelchair became a soaring dragon, flapping her arms with pure delight. The boy with autism transformed into a wise wizard, his repetitive hand movements suddenly looking like spell-casting gestures. But it was what happened next that would change everything. As the story reached its climax, the young woman began to speak about a special queen in her magical kingdom. Not a queen who lived in a palace and gave orders, but a queen who walked among her people and listened to their hearts. As she spoke, her eyes swept the area around them, and suddenly, they locked with the queen's. For a moment, time seemed suspended. The young woman's voice faltered slightly, and the queen felt her breath catch. Recognition flickered in the younger woman's eyes. Not the starstruck recognition of a celebrity encounter, but something deeper. Something that seemed to say, "I see you." Not the crown, not the title, but you. The queen stepped closer, drawn by an impulse she couldn't name. The children noticed her approach, and their chatter gradually faded as they sensed something significant was happening. "Please, don't stop," the queen said quietly to the young woman. "Your story, it's beautiful." The young woman, who would later introduce herself as Emma, smiled with a warmth that seemed to light up the growing dusk. "Would you like to sit with us? We were just getting to the best part." And in that moment, Queen Elizabeth II, Sovereign of the United Kingdom, Defender of the Faith, made a decision that would surprise everyone who knew her. She walked over to the blanket, lowered herself carefully to the ground, and joined the circle of children. Detective Inspector Collins nearly stepped forward in alarm. This was completely unprecedented. The Queen, sitting on a blanket on the ground with strangers in a public area, with no advanced security sweep or protocol in place. But something in the Queen's posture, a piece she had rarely seen in all her years of service, made her hold back and simply position herself where she could monitor the situation. "Now then," Emma continued, as if having the Queen join their story circle was the most natural thing in the world, this special queen discovered that her real magic wasn't in her crown or her palace, but in her ability to see the light inside every person she met. And do you know what happened when she used this magic? The children leaned in closer, and the Queen found herself doing the same. For the first time in decades, she was just another listener in a circle, waiting to discover what would happen next in a story she couldn't control or predict. What happened in the next hour would not only surprise everyone who witnessed it, but would set in motion a series of events that would touch lives in ways no one could have imagined. The Queen's afternoon walk was about to become something much more profound, a journey that would reveal depths of emotion and humanity that even those closest to her had never seen. As the golden autumn light began to fade around them, none of them could have predicted that this simple gathering under an old oak tree would become the beginning of one of the most remarkable and deeply moving chapters in the Queen's long life. Emma continued her story as if nothing unusual had happened, though her heart was racing. She had recognized the Queen immediately, but something in the older woman's eyes had told her that this wasn't a moment for protocol or formality. This was a moment for something else entirely. "The Queen in our story," Emma said, her voice steady despite her inner excitement, discovered that when she really listened to people, not as a ruler, but as a friend, magical things began to happen. Would you like to know what kind of magic? 8-year-old Lucy, who had been born with cerebral palsy and used a bright pink wheelchair, raised her hand eagerly. Did she make people happy? The Queen found herself leaning forward, genuinely curious about Emma's answer. She had spent her entire life in service to people, but the question of whether she had made them truly happy, really, deeply happy, was one she had wrestled with privately for years. "She did make people happy," Emma replied, "but not in the way you might think. She didn't give them money or fancy things. Instead, she gave them something much more precious. She gave them the feeling that they mattered." 10-year-old Marcus, the boy with autism who had been making repetitive hand movements, suddenly spoke up. His words came slowly but clearly. "My mum says I matter, but other people don't always think so." The Queen felt something tighten in her chest. She looked at Marcus, really looked at him, and saw not a child defined by his differences, but a young person with thoughtful eyes and careful words. Without thinking, she spoke directly to him. "Marcus," she said softly, "what makes you feel like you matter most?" The other children turned to look at her, and the Queen realized that this was perhaps the first time in decades that she had asked someone a personal question without any agenda, without any state purpose, simply because she wanted to know the answer.
Marcus considered her question seriously, his hand movements slowing as he concentrated.
"When someone listens to my ideas about airplanes, I know lots about airplanes, but people usually just see.
He gestured to his repetitive movements. This.
Tell me about airplanes, the Queen said, and in her voice was a curiosity that surprised even her. She had been briefed on aviation countless times for state visits and ceremonial occasions, but she had never simply sat with a child and asked about his passion. What followed was 15 minutes of the most detailed, enthusiastic explanation of aircraft engineering that any of them had ever heard. Marcus spoke about wing designs, engine types, and the physics of flight with a precision and joy that was absolutely captivating. The other children listened, fascinated, and Emma watched with amazement as the Queen asked follow-up questions that showed she was not just being polite, but was genuinely engaged. But it was what happened next that would become the heart of the story that the insider would later share. As Marcus finished explaining how jet engines work, he paused and looked directly at the Queen. "You're really listening?" he said with wonder in his voice. "Most adults pretend to listen, but you're really doing it." The Queen felt tears prick her eyes unexpectedly. When was the last time someone had thanked her simply for listening? When was the last time she had listened without an agenda, without thinking about the next appointment, the next duty, the next responsibility? "Marcus," she said, her voice slightly unsteady, "you've taught me something about airplanes that I never learned in all my official briefings." "Thank you." Emma watched this exchange with growing amazement, but she was even more surprised by what she saw in the Queen's face. The formal mask that had been there initially was completely gone now, replaced by something raw and real and deeply human. Little Lucy wheeled her chair closer to the Queen. "Are you sad?" she asked, with the directness that only children possess. The question hung in the air. Detective Inspector Collins tensed, ready to intervene if necessary. But the Queen held up a slight hand to indicate she was fine. "I'm not sad, Lucy," the Queen said slowly, "but I am moved." "Do you know what that means?" Lucy shook her head. "It means that being here with all of you is touching a part of my heart that I had forgotten existed." Emma felt her own eyes fill with tears as she watched this extraordinary woman, someone she had only ever seen as a distant figure on television, become completely vulnerably human before their eyes. "In our story," Emma said gently, "the Queen discovered that the most powerful thing she could do wasn't to rule people, but to connect with them. But she also learned something else. She learned that she had been so busy taking care of everyone else that she had forgotten to take care of something inside herself." The Queen looked at Emma sharply. It was as if this young woman could see right into her soul. "What did she need to take care of?" asked Sarah, a 9-year-old girl with Down syndrome, who had been quietly listening to everything. Emma's answer would later be remembered by everyone present as the moment that broke something open in all of them. She needed to remember that underneath her crown, she was still just a person who wanted the same things everyone wants. To be loved for who she really is, not for what she can do for others. The silence that followed was profound. The Queen sat very still, and those watching her closely would have seen her hands trembling slightly. "I think," the Queen said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "I think I had forgotten that." What happened next surprised everyone, including the Queen herself. She began to cry. These weren't the controlled, dignified tears that might escape during a particularly moving state ceremony. These were real tears of release, of recognition, of a lifetime of contained emotion finally finding expression. She didn't try to hide them or apologize for them. She simply let them fall. The children responded with an instinct that was purely loving. Lucy reached out from her wheelchair to pat the Queen's arm. Marcus stopped his hand movements and sat perfectly still, as if understanding that this was a sacred moment. Sarah moved closer and simply sat beside her, offering the wordless comfort that children give so naturally. Emma reached into her bag and quietly offered the Queen a tissue. But her gesture was gentle, not intrusive. She seemed to understand that this moment needed to unfold naturally, without interference. "Your Majesty," Detective Inspector Collins said softly, taking a step forward. She was concerned not just for security reasons, but because she had never seen the Queen in such a vulnerable state. The Queen looked up, her eyes still wet but somehow brighter than they had been in years. "It's all right, Sarah," she said to her protection officer. "I'm more than all right. I'm present. Really present, perhaps for the first time in years." She turned back to the children and Emma. "I'm sorry if I've surprised you all." "I don't usually. Don't apologize," Emma said firmly but kindly. "Feelings aren't something to be sorry for. There's something to be grateful for. They mean you're alive." The Queen smiled through her tears. "When I was young, I was taught that feelings were something to be controlled, managed. kept private. But sitting here with all of you, I realized that maybe some feelings are meant to be shared. Marcus, who had been watching her intently, suddenly spoke up. "You're not scary at all," he announced. "I thought queens would be scary, but you're just nice." The laughter that bubbled up from the queen was unlike any sound Detective Inspector Collins had heard from her in 20 years of service. It was unguarded, delighted, completely genuine. "Well, Marcus, I suppose I've learned something today, too. I've learned that being just nice might be the best compliment anyone has ever given me." As the sun began to set properly, casting long shadows across the grounds, Emma began to pack up her things. The children were reluctant to leave, and truthfully, so was the Queen. This impromptu gathering had become something none of them had expected. A moment of pure human connection that transcended all the usual boundaries and roles. "Will you come back tomorrow?" Lucy asked the Queen hopefully. The Queen looked at Emma questioningly. Do you do this often? Meet here with the children?" Emma nodded. 3 times a week. These kids, they're all part of a special program for children with different abilities. We meet here because it's peaceful, because stories seem more magical under old trees. The Queen was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then she made another decision that would surprise everyone. "Would it be all right if I joined you again? I find I would very much like to hear more stories." The joy on the children's faces was answer enough, but Emma's smile sealed it. "We would be honored," Emma said simply. As they all prepared to part ways, the Queen did something that would become part of the legend of that day. She bent down and hugged each child goodbye. Not the formal brief embraces she was used to giving, but real, warm hugs that conveyed genuine affection. When she reached Marcus, he looked up at her seriously. "Thank you for listening about airplanes," he said. "Thank you for reminding me how to really listen," she replied. As the Queen and Detective Inspector Collins walked back toward the castle, Collins finally spoke up. "Your Majesty, that was unprecedented? Unscheduled? Completely improper?" the Queen asked with a slight smile. "I was going to say beautiful," Collins replied quietly. The Queen stopped walking and looked back toward the oak tree where they had sat. The children and Emma were small figures in the distance now, but she could still hear echoes of their laughter. "Sarah," she said to a protection officer, "I want you to know that in 65 years of public service, this afternoon it's been one of the most important of my life." "Why, Your Majesty?" The Queen was quiet for a long moment, watching the last light fade from the sky. "Because, for the first time in decades, I wasn't performing being the Queen. I was simply being Elizabeth, and I had forgotten how good that felt." As they walked the final stretch back to Windsor Castle, neither of them spoke about what would happen tomorrow or how this encounter might change things. They simply walked in comfortable silence, both knowing they had witnessed something extraordinary. But the Queen's decision to return the next day would set in motion events that would surprise not only the children and Emma, but the entire royal household, and eventually, the world. The deeply emotional encounter was just beginning. The next morning brought chaos to Windsor Castle that no one had anticipated. Word of the Queen's unscheduled walk had reached her private secretary, James Morrison, who was now frantically trying to reschedule appointments while managing what he could only describe as a security nightmare. "She wants to do what again?" he asked Detective Inspector Collins, hoping he had misheard. "Return to meet with the children, sir. She's requested that her afternoon schedule be cleared for the next 3 days." Morrison sat heavily in his chair. In 30 years of royal service, he had never encountered a situation quite like this. The Queen didn't make spontaneous social commitments. She didn't clear her schedule for unvetted public encounters. She certainly didn't sit on blankets with strangers, but when he was summoned to her private study that morning, what he found was a Queen unlike any he had seen before. She was sitting by the window, looking out toward the long walk, and there was something in her posture, a lightness, an anticipation, that he had never observed. "James," she said before he could begin his prepared speech about security protocols and scheduling concerns, "I want you to arrange something for me." "Of course, Your Majesty. What would you like arranged?" "I want you to find out about Emma's program for these children. I want to know what they need, what would help them, how we might support what they're doing." Morrison blinked. "I'm sorry, Your Majesty, Emma." The Queen turned from the window, and Morrison was struck by the clarity in her eyes. "The young woman who has been working with these children, she's doing something remarkable, James, and I want to understand it better." What Morrison discovered over the next few hours would astound him. Emma Richardson was a speech therapist who volunteered her time working with children with various developmental and physical challenges. She had started the outdoor story sessions 6 months earlier, after noticing that many of her young clients seemed to blossom when they were outside the clinical environment of traditional therapy settings. She had no funding beyond her own pocket, no official recognition, no support beyond the gratitude of the families she helped. She simply showed up 3 afternoons a week with stories, snacks, and an unlimited capacity for seeing the potential in every child she met. "She sounds extraordinary," the Queen said when Morrison delivered his report. "I would like to help." "Help how, Your Majesty?" The Queen smiled. "I'm not entirely sure yet, but I know I want to be there this afternoon." When the Queen arrived at the oak tree the next day, she found not only Emma and the original group of children, but several new faces as well. Word had spread, carefully and quietly, among families in the area who had children with special needs, and the circle had grown. Emma looked slightly overwhelmed but pleased. "Your Majesty, I hope you don't mind that we have a few more friends today." "The more the merrier," the Queen replied, settling herself on the blanket with an ease that surprised everyone, including herself. What unfolded over the next 2 hours was magical in the truest sense. The Queen listened to stories, but she also began to tell them. Drawing from her decades of experience meeting people from all walks of life, she shared tales about her travels, about interesting people she had met, about the funny things that happened behind palace walls. But more than that, she began to play. She made voices for characters in Emma's stories. She helped Marcus demonstrate how airplane wings worked by holding up her arms and moving around the circle. She cheered when Lucy's wheelchair became a racing chariot in one adventure, and she applauded when Sarah showed everyone how she could count to 20 in sign language. Detective Inspector Collins watched from her position nearby, marveling at the transformation she was witnessing. The woman sitting in that circle bore little resemblance to the formal figure who attended state dinners and ceremonial events. This was someone Collins had never seen before, someone spontaneous, playful, completely present. It was during the 3rd day that the most profound moment occurred. Emma had just finished a story about courage, about how real bravery wasn't about not being afraid, but about doing important things even when you were scared. As the children discussed what courage meant to them, 10-year-old David, a boy with autism who rarely spoke, suddenly looked directly at the Queen. "Are you scared sometimes?" he asked. The question caught everyone off guard. The children fell silent, sensing that David had asked something important. Emma held her breath, wondering how the Queen would respond to such a direct, personal question. The Queen was quiet for a long moment, and those watching closely could see her considering not just her words, but whether to answer honestly or deflect as she had been trained to do for decades. "Yes, David," she said finally, "I am scared sometimes." "What scares you?" David asked with the persistence that often characterizes children with autism when they're genuinely interested in something. Again, the Queen paused. Detective Inspector Collins tensed, ready to intervene if the conversation went too far into territory that might compromise the Queen's privacy or dignity. But the Queen seemed to come to a decision. "I'm scared that I might not be doing enough," she said quietly. "I'm scared that all the time I spend in meetings and ceremonies and official duties might not actually be helping the people who really need it. I'm scared that I might be invisible to the people who matter most." The honesty of this admission sent a ripple through the entire group. Emma felt tears spring to her eyes as she witnessed this powerful woman exposing her deepest vulnerability to a group of children. Marcus, who had become particularly attached to the Queen over the 3 days, moved closer to her. "You're not invisible to us," he said firmly. "We see you. The real you." What happened next would be talked about by everyone present for years to come. The Queen reached out and took Marcus's hand, and then she began to speak from her heart in a way that none of them had ever heard before. "You know," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "for most of my life I've felt like I was supposed to be perfect, never make mistakes, never show weakness, never let anyone see that underneath this title and these clothes, I'm just a person who sometimes doesn't know what she's doing." She looked around the circle at all the faces watching her intently. "But sitting here with all of you, I realized that maybe being perfect isn't what's important. Maybe what's important is being real. Maybe what matters is not having all the answers, but caring enough to ask the right questions." Lucy wheeled her chair closer. "What questions do you want to ask?" The Queen smiled through tears that were becoming familiar now. "I want to ask how I can do better. I want to ask what you need. I want to ask how someone like me can help people like you feel as special as you really are. Emma, who had been silently crying throughout this exchange, finally found her voice. Your Majesty, you're already doing it. You're here. You're listening. You're seeing these children as they really are, not as their diagnoses or limitations. Do you know how rare that is? The Queen shook her head. It shouldn't be rare. It should be normal. Then make it normal, said Sarah, the little girl with Down syndrome who rarely spoke up in large groups. Her words came out clear and strong. You're the Queen. You can change things. The simplicity and directness of this statement hit the Queen like a revelation. She had spent decades working within systems, following protocols, maintaining traditions. But sitting in this circle, surrounded by children who saw possibility where others saw limitations, she began to understand that real change often started with real connection. You're absolutely right, Sarah, the Queen said. I can change things. And I think I'd like to start right here.
What the Queen announced next would send shockwaves through the royal establishment and eventually make headlines around the world.
I want to create a foundation, she said, the idea forming even as she spoke.
A foundation that supports programs like Emma's. That recognizes the extraordinary potential in every child, regardless of their challenges. That brings people together in circles like this one, where everyone is valued and everyone belongs. The excitement among the children was immediate and infectious. They began talking all at once, sharing ideas about what such a foundation could do, how it could help other children, what they would call it. But Emma looked concerned. Your Majesty, that's incredibly generous, but you don't understand. I'm nobody special. I'm just a speech therapist who likes telling stories outside. The Queen reached over and took Emma's hands. My dear Emma, you are exactly what's special. You see potential where others see problems. You create magic where others see limitations. You've reminded me that the most important work we can do is often the simplest, just showing up for each other. Over the next hour, as the afternoon light began to fade, they planned together. The children contributed ideas with the boundless creativity that adults often lose. Marcus suggested airplane-themed therapy programs. Lucy wanted art sessions where kids in wheelchairs could paint murals. David thought there should be special quiet spaces for children who got overwhelmed in regular social settings. Emma shared her dreams about expanding the program, about training other therapists to work outdoors, about creating communities where children with special needs weren't just accommodated but celebrated. And the Queen listened to it all, asking questions, taking mental notes, but most importantly, imagining a future where this kind of inclusive, joyful approach to supporting children became the norm rather than the exception. As the gathering came to an end, the Queen made one more announcement that surprised everyone. I want you all to come to the castle, she said. I want to show you the gardens there, and I want you to help me choose where we might set up a permanent space for programs like this one. Would you like that? The chorus of excitement from the children was answer enough, but it was Emma's response that sealed the moment. Your Majesty, she said, I think you've just proven that the most powerful form of leadership isn't about commanding from above. It's about sitting in the circle and listening to what matters most. As they all prepared to leave that day, the Queen realized that her afternoon walks had become something far more significant than anyone could have predicted. She had set out simply wanting to feel more connected to the world beyond her official duties. Instead, she had discovered a new purpose, a new way of understanding her role, and most importantly, a new way of being herself. Detective Inspector Collins watched as the Queen said goodbye to each child with the same careful attention she had always given to heads of state and dignitaries. But these goodbyes were different. They were filled with genuine affection, with promises to see each other again soon, with the kind of warmth that comes from real relationship rather than formal duty. As they walked back to the castle one final time, the Queen was quiet for most of the journey. Finally, as they approached the gates, she spoke. Sarah, I want you to know that these past 3 days have changed something in me. Something I thought had been lost a long time ago. What's that, Your Majesty? The Queen stopped and looked back one more time toward the oak tree, now barely visible in the growing dusk. Hope, she said simply. Hope that there are still ways to do this job that matter. Hope that it's not too late to make a real difference. And hope that being real is actually more powerful than being perfect. The foundation that grew out of those 3 afternoons under the oak tree would go on to support thousands of children and families across the United Kingdom and beyond. It would revolutionize approaches to therapy and special education, and it would become one of the Queen's most personal and cherished legacies. But for those who were there in the beginning, Emma, Detective Inspector Collins, and especially the children who first welcomed their Queen into their circle, the real miracle wasn't what grew from those meetings. The real miracle was what they witnessed in those quiet moments under an old tree, the transformation of a monarch into a human being, and the discovery that sometimes the most deeply emotional encounters happen not in grand ceremonies or historic events, but in simple circles where everyone is welcome, everyone is valued, and everyone belongs.
The insider who shared this story concluded with a simple observation. I've witnessed many significant moments in the Queen's long reign, but I've never seen her more herself than she was sitting on that blanket, surrounded by children who saw her not as a title or a symbol, but simply as someone worth knowing.
In a world that often feels divided and disconnected, those 3 days reminded all of us what becomes possible when we dare to be real with each other. The Queen had indeed surprised everyone, but perhaps no one more than herself.